on today. It's such a challenging day in terms of weather. My name is Lisa Moore, and I'm Curator of the Education and Community Department, and this is my colleague Sophie Byrne, who's the Coordinator of the Talks and Lectures programme. This is the fifth talk in the What Is series, although, no, it's a repeat of the first talk of the What Is series. But just to say, for those of you who aren't familiar with the What Is Talk series, it's a series of talks around certain themes around modern and contemporary art. We have another talk in the What Is series on the 11th of December, Saturday the 11th of December, What Is Public Art. And then the last talk in this current series will be on what is performance art, and that will be in the spring of next year. Just a couple of things to remind you of: if you can turn off your phones, and also just take note of where the exits are as well. And just to say about in terms of the What Is series, these booklets are at the back of the room for any of you who haven't picked them up already, and each of the booklets includes a little bit of introductory text about the topic. It will include text by the various presenters. For each talk we've invited different presenters, so there's a whole range of perspectives from lecturers, artists, writers, critics. And then each of the booklets also includes some supplementary information, such as a glossary of terms, resources information, reading lists and things like that. We are actually in the process of developing up our web-based resources which complement this material. So you can also download the booklets from our website, and some of that supplementary material is also available on our website. That's pretty much it. I'm going to hand you over to Sophie now.
Thank you. I'd also like to welcome you to, and as Lisa mentioned, I'm Sophie Byrne, and I manage the Talks and Lectures programme here. And today's talk as well, today's talk, which is Modern and Contemporary Art under the What Is title series. And to open up the themes of discussion for today, we've invited for the second time round, because the last time was so popular, the course coordinators and lecturers of the interdisciplinary MA programme titled Art in the Contemporary World at National College of Art and Design in Dublin, and to present their paper, How Soon Was Now, What Is Modern and Contemporary Art, which Lisa mentioned is in the orange colour booklet, What Is Modern and Contemporary Art. By way of introduction to both our speakers, firstly we have Frances Halsall, who completed an MA PhD in art history from Glasgow University and is currently working towards a PhD in philosophy at UCD. Frances is also a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Practice. His recent publications include Systems of Art 2008 and Rediscovering Aesthetics in 2009. Joining Frances, we have his colleague Declan Long, who is a board member of Douglas Hyde Gallery and regularly writes on contemporary art in a range of Irish and international magazines. Recent and published material includes essays on Willa von Brandenburg and Willie Doherty and many other artists. Both Frances and Declan will make their presentation, which will last for about 40 to 45 minutes. Yeah, looking at that. And then we'll invite questions from the floor, and then hopefully conclude with an open discussion. So we're probably looking at maybe finishing up around 1 o'clock, 1:15, depending how far we go into discussion. So at this stage, I suppose I'll hand you over to our speakers, but perhaps we can give them a welcome as well.
So, Lisa, thanks for inviting us. I'll just explain what we're going to do. There'll be a very kind of short introduction, of which this is part of the introduction. And then I'll talk for about 10-15 minutes, I think, upon the theme of modern. I'm trying to come up with some definition or some sort of coordinates, anyway, for thinking about what modern might mean in relation to art, modernism and modernity. And then I'll pass over to Declan, who will spend about 15 minutes talking about the contemporary in relation to, in the essay that we wrote together, we picked 4 themes around which you might sort of coordinate contemporary practice. So we will, we'll try to keep to those terms. I think we'll inevitably overrun, but we'll try not to. And then there's provision for opening, as you were saying, for opening up to questions and so on. Because I think when we did this the last time, that seemed to be very productive. There was a way of responding to questions, sort of teasing some ideas out. Do you want to add anything?
No, other than just to say thanks to Sophie and Lisa for having us back, which suggests that we didn't
Did a good job.
make a complete mess of it the last time, which is good news. And thank all of you for coming on a very difficult day to make it out for these sorts of things, not only because of the weather conditions, but also because of the big march that's on in town, which I know I'm sure some of you would like to watch out. So just that's all I want to say. And Francis will begin and move through modern art, and then I'll say a few things about a few works of contemporary art.
Great. So we open the essay with these two examples, which I'm not going to talk about now, but as a means of sort of thinking about what contemporary art looks like today. Declan's going to talk about these after I have. The first of these then is the World War Lesson by Phil Collins, which, broadly speaking, involves people singing Smith's song in various different places around the world. Declan will talk about that in more detail. Here's an image of that. And then the second of these is a film piece by Philip Pereno, which it was called The Boy from Mars. And this is a piece which relates to a kind of land project called The Land, but it's also a film work, so it's two different things at once, and we'll touch on that in a few moments. I think sometimes contemporary art can seem baffling, or it can seem very, very sort of difficult and obscure, and sometimes it's assumed, I'm not saying that you assume this, but that it has nothing to do with more traditional art, or even that it has anything to do with modern art. And I think one of the things we're trying to do in this essay, and perhaps we'll tease this out and what we'll have to say here in further conversations, is that we can sort of look for interrelationships between contemporary practice and older forms of art making. As has been said, all art was contemporary once. All art was new at one point. All art was responding to the modern at some point. So I think part of what we're looking at here is a sort of relationships between different types of art. Okay, for the first part then that I want to talk about and ask this question, what is modernism? We've got two images here, the one on my right, sorry I'm looking at it a different way. The painting is very famous paintings by Picasso, the Demoiselle d'Avignon, generally seen as being one of the most, if not the most important painting of the 20th century, not least because this is where a lot of modernism sort of takes its cue, certainly the kind of moving towards abstraction. And the other one, which we have there, is Damien Hirst, For the Love of God, which became very, very famous for being the most expensive artwork ever made at one point. Skull covered in diamonds. And we can use these are separated by 100 years, but we could, in some senses, they're both modern. And I think this is a way of thinking through then, what does modernism mean? Because it means different things to different people. It can be this answer of what is modernism can be answered in different ways. For the sake of argument here, I think we might think about it three up there, from within a kind of an art historical perspective, which is the perspective I'm speaking from. We can think of modernism as a period, and broadly speaking, that period is some period of Western art making between sort of the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century. I've got some examples to show you in just a second. It's from the mid-20th century onwards we see the beginnings of a postmodern. But to think of it as a period is already perhaps slightly problematic. Does that mean that things that came before then, for example, are pre-modern? Does that mean that things that come after it are after-modern, post-modern? These are things which are complicated. We call the Picasso painting a modern painting, or he said it's one of the most important modernist paintings. But does that mean that it's now out of date? Because it's well over 100 years old. Is this an antique? Or does it still have a kind of contemporary resonance? That's the kind of question. Even the Hirst, for example, is sort of 3 years old now. Does this mean that it's no longer contemporary? So if modernism is a period, what are the problems with that? Is it a style? As we'll see, some of the paintings I've got to show you, some of the art, which I'll very quickly show you, is often very, very different in style. So to think of modernism as a singular style is also very problematic. If you just go to the Modern Show, when the contents of this taking place, for example, you'll see a variety of different things made in the name of modernism, including furniture and architecture and painting of different types. I think it's at the very least it's problematic to say that there's a single style to modernism. Or thirdly, and this is the point I want to argue today, I think we're both arguing here, is modernism perhaps a kind of an attitude? Is it a way of doing things? And I think there's a couple of things at stake in thinking of it like that. That it's an attitude of reflexivity, thinking through what it is to make something in a particular moment in time, and it's a means of finding a form of contemporary expression. It's a way of finding a way of expressing contemporary conditions. And the reason I think it's important to argue that this idea of modernism being an attitude is, this means that it can be an attitude that isn't necessarily specific to France in 1907 or America in the 1950s, but this attitude of searching to find a contemporary expression for a contemporary situation is one that's still live today. I think the examples that Declan has to show that, contemporary responses to the situation. Said that we could think of modernism as being a kind of, in terms of the period, as being 100 years. I think it's relatively uncontroversial to say that sort of modernism begins with this painting. The beginnings of a form of Impressionism, and this isn't an Impressionist painting, Impressionism is later, it's 1874, the first Impressionist painting. But we see here the beginnings of a kind of recognisably avant-garde style. The altering of perspective, for example, one we find is very big and simply. So Manet is playing around with ideas of perspective. If you look at the passage at the bottom here, the fruit, for example, it's very kind of roughly painted, loose handling of paint. All of these things are drawing attention to the conditions of painting. And this is the painting that was kind of famously in the Salon of Refused Art. It wasn't accepted by the Salon for exhibition. But we could say that this is also a kind of doing very, very similar things to Manet. It's 100 years later, 19 years later. It's responding to a contemporary situation, dealing with paint as paint, questioning notions of representation. This is both a flag and a representation of a flag. So again, we've got a kind of troubling of this idea of period or style in terms of modernism, because these are both obviously very different styles and they're both obviously very different periods historically. Even if we think about a kind of a modernism as being something that's up to date, we can see Manet here, and this is one of the reasons that it's kind of so shocking, perhaps, to its contemporary audience, drawing on traditional subject matter. From the Giorgione, the pastoral concert, an obvious reference that's being made here by Manet. And if you see the bottom right there from the Raphaels, from the engraving of Raphael as well, there's direct quotations being made there as its source material. I think the point here is that one of the reasons that this is so shocking is that Manet has taken those kind of motifs and he's divorced them from kind of an art history. He's divorced them from an any time and he's made them utterly contemporary. This is a real woman sitting in a real space with real men, giving this sort of utter contemporary resonance. So he's placing his painting in an absolute moment of now, in an absolute now, rather than in some kind of mystical, historical, mythical, classical time. Picasso also then, I said this painting is very, very kind of significant, also draws upon source material. El Greco, we know, was kind of an important source for Jonathan. Motif there in the middle of the three figures, something that Picasso is quoting. And my reason for kind of showing these is to suggest that however modern art might seem, that it has perhaps some relationship to art history and sometimes inheres within history as a relationship to it. As I said, all art is kind of contemporary at one point. And all art responds to its media and works within it. It's been suggested that actually art, as we understand it today, begins with the Renaissance, the very beginnings of the Renaissance with paintings such as this, Giotto's Lamentation, and the Arena Chapel in Padua. But this was also an example of new media at its time. He was using here a new medium in a new way, in this case fresco. Fresco, which involves the painting onto wet plaster. And because he's using media in a certain way, that means that there are kind of certain stylistic choices which Giotto's had to make. You have to plan the image way in advance, for example, on a cartoon, on charcoal, in order that you don't make mistakes. If you're painting on wet plaster, if you're painting fresco, you can't make mistakes because they will be forever there. Very different from painting with oil, for example, where you can change and overpaint and overpaint. The point to show this then is that all art is also a kind of responds to its media. It's a new medium. All art will use media in a new way and will respond to new media. Another argument that's been made, for example, is that Impressionism wouldn't have been possible without the invention of portable oil paint. In the way that the beginnings of the Renaissance arguably comes about in the rediscovery of fresco. So, modern art then kind of situates itself in a now, situates itself in a kind of contemporary situation, and as a response to that, according to the mediums that it has at its kind of hand, mediums that it has available to it. This is what Courbet says then, when he kind of makes this statement. Courbet's a realist painter, but he's also making a statement here that is relevant to a way of thinking about what modern art is, the way that it would respond to its contemporary position and situation. Courbet says, in the middle of the 19th century, to be able to translate the customs, ideas, and appearances of my time as I see them, in a word, to create a living art, this has been my aim. I hold also that painting is essentially a concrete art, and can consist only of the representations of things both real and existing. An abstract object, invisible or non-existent, does not belong to the domain of painting. Show me an angel, and I'll paint one. For him then, coming up with a kind of a modernist art, painting such as this is ridiculous. And this is the painting that won the prize at the Salon in 1863, when Manet's painting was rejected. But this is not a modern painting because it's taking its cues from sort of classical or mythical or an art historical past. It's not grounding itself in a here and now. Unlike Barrière-Dornan, Courbet, an example here of realism, which is responding quite directly to a contemporary subject matter. It's painting a now. It's painting a modern subject matter in a modern way. Same as Picasso then as well. Sometimes Picasso is criticised for his dryness, or perhaps his conceptualism. Some people refer to Picasso as inhuman, for example. But even he is responding to a very kind of particular contemporary situation. It's been pointed out. Paper clipping on the bottom is an example of papier collé. This is just after the emergence of collage in 1912. The battle is engaged. There's a battle that's engaged here, perhaps with contemporary art, so there's a pun going on there. A pun, again, jouet, journal. But it's a pun on the kind of the daily news, but it's a pun on the kind of the daily situation as well. The battle is engaged. This is also a direct reference to the emerging war in the Balkans. Art historians have written about this, the way in which there was always a kind of, or often a kind of political agency to what Picasso, the way in which Picasso positioned his art. He was later to paint very famously a response to Guernica. He was also to paint response to the Korean War as well. So, but this sort of putting in there that fragment of the paper, a fragment of the contemporary, is also a demonstration of the way in which the artist used this medium at their, that they have available to respond to a specifically contemporary situation. Perhaps then also Mondrian is also doing that, looking for sort of new ways of responding to art. And even though, again, he's also been called inhuman, by pushing his medium and investigating the kind of very, very kind of limits of his medium, he's trying to find a way of saying something new in a new way. Jackson Pollock then in the 50s, coming to the end of the section here, also says that that's what the modern artist needs to do. They need to respond to a contemporary situation in a contemporary way. Push the limits of their medium to find out what's possible within that medium. My opinion is that new art needs new techniques, and the modern artists have found new means of making their statements. It seems to me, and he's writing this in the 50s, it seems to me that the modern painter cannot express this age, the aeroplane, the atom bomb, the radio, and the old forms of the Renaissance or of any other past culture. Each age finds its own technique. And I think that's the sort of the conclusion that I'm trying to put across here in this kind of this first part, that that's what the modern artist does. They try to find their own technique for their age. But that's what Mondrian was doing. That's what Picasso was doing. That's what Giotto was doing. And that's what Pollock was doing as well. And the reason for thinking about it in this way is that that provides a way of thinking about what contemporary artists are doing as well, trying to find a response to Twitter and the internet, or by contemporary art is a terrible thing. Whatever the kids are doing these days. But that's what Pollock is trying to do as well. He's trying to give a form to a contemporary situation. This is certainly how T.J. Clarke then sees the emergence of Impressionism. That in the form of Impressionism, he's trying to give a form to changed circumstances, the rise of urbanism, post-revolutionary France, the Paris of the boulevards, and of the emergence of a later form of capitalism, the emergence of the crowd. Manet's painting then must have been felt to be somehow appropriate to the social forms the painter had chosen to show. But this is actually a demonstration of the spirit of the age in a painted form. Modernity, Clarke argues, is given a form and made visible by particular types of art. So as modernity changes, and we find ourselves right now in new forms of modernity, with new forms of technology, new forms of social organisation and interaction, just as there is a new modernity, there needs to be new forms of art in order to express that modernity. That's what T.J. Clarke is arguing about this, and I think this has a sort of contemporary relevance. For him then, I mean, very, very kind of simply, the emergence of the crowd in the modern city is depicted here in a kind of an impressionistic way as the individuals themselves become lost in paint. Figure ground become kind of conflated. So just as we might become lost in a crowd, so too the figures themselves are sort of lost in the paint. It's perhaps a slightly simplistic way of putting it, but it's something that's statement. The concluding examples then kind of further show that point, the way in which artists are responding to modernity and trying to find forms for that modernity. Duchamp's famous Nude Descending a Staircase. One way of thinking about this is a response to contemporary forms of photography. How do you capture that notion of simultaneity in a single painting? Famously kind of responding to and with. This is kind of interesting, I think, because it's sort of seen as having a... Duchamp, even though there's a kind of parody of it, Duchamp is seen as actually kind of capturing something there of modern experience, the confusion of modern experience, the urgency of modern life. Or the fountain, ready-made work of art, challenges everything that was thought about on that. Or the Brillo box, again, challenging what it is that makes something a work of art. Whether it's made by an artist, whether it's a valuable object, whether it's a singular object, whether it's a unique object, and so on. Or finally, and this is where I pass over to Declan, this is a very kind of recent project by the artist Phil Collins, who started with that. And this is part of an ongoing series called the Berlin, well, it's called the Photo Lab, and this is the Berlin iteration, where he goes into snappy snaps or local photograph processing kind of shop, and offers to pay for people's photographs to be developed on condition that he gets copies of them. So that's a photo of the project. And these throw up kind of very, very kind of interesting images then, which he then exhibits. This is ones that are both kind of personal and completely anonymous, that have these kind of narratives that we're perhaps seduced by, but we also kind of never really know what's going on. But I think, and this is where I pass over to Declan, I think that what Phil Collins is doing here is what all the other artists that I've shown are doing. They're trying to find some form of expression of a contemporary experience. In ways that sometimes look like painting, and other times are just plain weird. I have no idea what's going on. All right, I'll pass it.
Thanks, Francis. So I'm going to try and follow up on that by looking a little bit at some of the directions taken in contemporary art, in the art that perhaps follows from modernism, particularly though I want to look at some reasonably up-to-date things. You know, not talking about being really ultra current, but reasonably up-to-date. And I want to consider, I suppose, given the huge amount of art that's out there at the moment, and there really has been an enormous proliferation of types of art, types of exhibition spaces, means of accessing images, and I'd like to think how we might position ourselves in relation to this, or how we might begin to find some patterns here and there. What this involves then, I suppose, is asking what art is now. So we're asking, not just what is contemporary art, we're asking what art is. Francis gave us a very clear picture of some of the ways in which art evolved for its time in the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. So we are interested now in asking what art is, but we're also asking what the contemporary is now. If Francis was noting that art was made according to the particular contingencies of its own time, we need to think a little bit about what our time is, what kinds of circumstances and forces and influences there are that bear on art, and what ways might art seek to respond or intervene or creatively reimagine those circumstances. It can be asked today, given the huge proliferation of types of art and amounts of art out there, that art perhaps can be almost anything. Francis used a couple of very, very important examples a moment or two ago, Marcel Duchamp's Fountain and Andy Warhol's Brillo boxes, where we have things that are objects in the world that are in their form, in their shape and size and material. They're exactly like things that exist ordinarily within the routine everyday world, but they change because they are placed within an art context. Their intention, the intention in relation to these objects changes. The response, the expectations around them changes according to their situation. So these are things which suggest from the early part of the 20th century that art has become radically plural, that it can be pretty much anything. That something already existing in our ordinary lives can be replaced in a way to become art, which of course creates enormous confusion and interest in how that happens. What is the nature of the process that allows anything to become art? But today we see such a proliferation that we don't necessarily see art taking any particular forms. Visual art, for instance, the term visual art is becoming less and less easy to use, because much of the art that's important today has a strong oral or tactile element. And as this writer Linda Weintraub suggests, contemporary art embraces the maverick and the traditionalist. No topic, no medium, no process, no intention, no professional protocols, and no aesthetic principles are exempt from the field of art. Now, this is both exhilarating potentially, in the sense that there's a tremendous, democracy of art. That there's a breaking away from prior hierarchies and strict categories. But it's also potentially worrying. What's at stake in any particular decision, if anything, can be art. I'll whopper of a quote here, apologies for this. And I'll make one other little apology as well. In preparation here, in setting up the PowerPoint, a couple of the images have fallen out of the presentation, so I just have to talk about them and let you imagine them, and perhaps give you the sense that these are the best artworks that you've never ever seen. But Terry Smith, in his conveniently titled book, What is Contemporary Art, has suggested that we need to really think about this multiplicity of contemporary art in relation to the very fluid forms of life that define our own modern conditions. He says contemporary art has become, in its forms and its contents, its meanings and its usages, thoroughly questioning in nature. This is something that certainly follows from what Francis was suggesting, and extremely wide-ranging in its modes of asking and in the scope of its inquiries. At the same time, in the absence of historical guarantees and the half-light of the deadly competition for global control, So on the one hand, we have the absence of certain kinds of certainties that we might have relied on throughout the 20th century and prior centuries, whether the certainties of religion or science or you know, theories that explain the world to us, like Marxism. These sorts of theories, which for many people have become less trustworthy, less reliable in more recent times. And in the half-life of deadly competition for global control, the new conditions within which art must create space for itself, new forms of politics. Art, like every other human activity, can be no more than provisional as to its expectations about answers. So this is the important bit, I guess, in terms of what we think about what contemporary art might be or how it might be. He says, provocative testers, doubt-filled gestures, equivocal objects, tentative projections, diffident propositions, or hopeful anticipations. These are the most common forms of art today. So there's something about this which suggests that art is not about, that if it is multiple, if it is radically plural, it's also something which is doubt-filled and which is provisional. It's about a certain kind of experimenting. What makes these concerns distinct from the contemporary preoccupations of previous art, Smith says, is that they are addressed explicitly, although more often implicitly, not only by each work of art to itself and to its contemporaries, but also and definitively as an interrogation of the ontology of the present, of the actual conditions of being in the present, of what the present is. One that asks, what is it to exist in the conditions of contemporaneity? So if we ask what is contemporary art is, Terry Smith is saying, is asking what is contemporary and what is contemporary art. So there's a kind of complicated circling here. Contemporary art is an investigation into the conditions of being contemporary. And that's one way of looking at it, at least. So when we go back to those examples that Francis flagged for us at the beginning, well, we have the artist Phil Collins, a young English artist, born and brought up close